Thanks for coming. We're excited to be here in force because we're interested, as you are, in some of the developing trends out there, especially as it relates to marijuana and some of the new legal or legislative and regulatory things going on. So Richard is going to present hair testing, some case studies, the science behind it, and some data that we collect. As some of you may know, we've been in this business for a long, long time and have probably the most robust data set you'll find anywhere. He's going to do that. I'm going to tell you a couple of quick stories just to kind of set the context because, a show of hands, how many are familiar with hair testing today? Hands up. Okay, good. So we're not starting with a blank slate. What I'd like to do is, go ahead, Richard, is talk a little about a historical perspective. And it's pretty simple and actually kind of interesting as well. So back in about 1984-85, the University of Texas Library had a complete set of John Keats. People know who John Keats is, the English poet, the romanticist that a lot of us guys didn't read much of. But John Keats, the poet back in the about 170 years ago, 175 years ago, passed away. Along with the works that were kept at the University of Texas, there were a few locks of his hair. The people that ran the library had heard of a guy named Dr. Baumgartner who had come up with a hair testing technique for drugs. The question being, was John Keats a drug abuser? And so they brought a small sample of the hair, tests were run. Lo and behold, it turned out that John Keats had heavy concentrations of laudanum in his system, which was a common treatment at the time for tuberculosis, which he had. So that kind of validated for them that he had lots of drugs in his system while he was writing a lot of romantic poetry. So what we got out of that was investors, Time magazine article, and the founding of a company, which was Psychemedics. Next slide. Then a few years later, about 1994, the American Beethoven Society was able to purchase some locks of Beethoven's hair. And the way that happened was, the day after Beethoven's death, as was the custom at the time, a few locks of his hair were taken by some of the people that were around him. Some of those were put into a locket. That locket went through a couple of family hands in Europe, found its way to the US, and then went up for auction by Sotheby's in about 1994-95. A group of 5 people got together that were part of the American Beethoven Society, and they bought that sample. They wanted to do some DNA testing, they wanted to do some drug testing. So that drug test was run on Beethoven's hair to answer the question, was he a drug abuser in the last months of his life? He was in a lot of pain. And people had always speculated maybe some of his work had suffered because of that. The test was brought to Psychemedics. That test was run. There was no evidence of any drugs in his system. So, and by the way, the DNA testing that was done later found heavy concentrations of lead in his system, which was what probably accounted for the chronic pain that he had into his life. So you think about those two examples, these old hair samples, and the question that popped into my head when I heard the story was, how do you guys do? In fact, when I was talking to the CEO of Psychemedics before I came on board, I said, well, how do you guys do that? And he said, well, it's pretty simple. In the first place, shelf life. So you take a sample of hair. We know for certain that it's got at least 167-year shelf life, maybe more. Other testing methodologies, not so much. 167 years later, you get, I guess, dry beakers of fluids that may have evaporated, or you find a 167-year-old person to test. So either way, the 167-year-old shelf life is a big deal. The other thing that made it possible was sort of the look back. And Richard will talk more about this because when you look at the different testing methodologies, they all have a place and they're all important. The thing that we were able to do with this particular set of tests we ran was to look back at the historical usage of both Keats and Beethoven for that last 90 days or so before that hair sample was taken. So that was what we were able to do with that sample. What I want to do now, with those two kind of stories in your head, so there's some neat science behind all this, and there's some really cool data that has come out that Richard's going to share with you about trends, which is what I think most of you are here to try and learn about anyway. So with that, I want to introduce Richard Clay. Richard is a VP at Psychemedics, and I'll go ahead and say it because he won't. He kind of pioneered hair testing in this town for all of the oil and gas companies here, most of whom I've been to several events with him, track him down at one point or another to kind of pick his brain some. So you've got the best guy in front of you today to talk about hair testing, how it applies in this particular industry, what he's seen as trends develop, and where he thinks it's going. So with that, I want to introduce Richard Clay and let him take it from here.
Thank you, AJ, very much. Very kind. I see a lot of friends out here, and so that's always great. But certainly, I think there's always an evolution of trying to understand the science and the application, the use of the science. And the one aspect of which, when you kind of look at this graph and how it's laid out, you know, as AJ said, you know, hair testing has a place, but quite frankly, you know, to have a comprehensive program, you have to look at both short-term and long-term. Obviously, hair grows about 1/2 inch per month. You look at the first 1.5 inches representing 90 days. And that gives you a good, significant track record of what their history is. But if you look at this gap here, this gap is intentionally there because it's missing the first 5 to 7 days. So that gap is there simply because it hasn't grown above the scalp line. And so therefore, when the sample is taken at the scalp line, that's your tape recorder that you're looking at. Before that, then you're looking at recent use. And so the applications of for cause, suspicion, injury, all of those kinds of elements are really the best application for urine, oral, blood, because it's looking at recent use. And you combine those, you have a very complementary process of being able to look at both short-term and long-term. When you look at the economics, ultimately you're looking at, and you know, these numbers sometimes don't mean a lot until it happens to your company. Invariably, when you look at the impact of it, the Department of Labor is saying it's costing $81 billion. $81 billion is broken out into, you know, worker comp, insurance claims, site list turnover rates, several things really kind of come into play where you're really having to deal with what's the economics of hiring a drug user. Typically, that cost ranges from some estimates $7,000, some estimates $15,000 per drug user that's working in your company. And I think the goal here is to have first and foremost an effective deterrent. And a deterrent simply means that not only are you testing, but you're ensuring that someone isn't evading a test in order to capture this $81 billion. That number is likely to grow. And it's going to likely grow as our economy continues to improve. The oil and gas industry and upstream, downstream are realizing that. Thank goodness. I grew up in West Texas, so I know the peaks and valleys that go with that. And the result is that you're really having to dig a little deeper into the labor pool now to find people to work in that environment. Though well compensated, you're going deeper into a pool that may be more complicated to find people who can pass a background, pass a drug test, can meet the requirements of the industry. And it's a real challenge because you end up hiring people or trying to accommodate a policy or modifying a policy such that you're allowing people who pose risk into your company. So invariably that $81 billion is always the concern, but when you start talking about our subject today being marijuana, you're really talking about it has changed a lot since in 1995 when I was in college. It's increased by 4 times more potent. And now the cultivation of marijuana, and now the legality, as you well know, in various states and in Canada. And those things now are getting to be a pretty good science in trying to cultivate a more powerful marijuana. Cigarette, joint, and they're, you know, candy, it's dispersed in a variety of ways, but this isn't what it was. It's now much stronger, much more potent, and much more impactful on our abilities to react. In an industry, in any industry that's safety sensitive, the ability to react is the difference between sometimes a close call and an incident. And I think invariably when you look at post-accident situations, you're talking about people who either suffering from sleep deprivation or their inability to react. When you look at 55% of employees who test positive for marijuana in the industry have industrial accidents. Again, that goes back to the reaction time. If you're not able to respond, react, and think clearly, then you're not able to drive, you're not able to, whether it be a forklift, truck, crane, whatever it may be, you're not able to react in time to and sometimes prevent an incident from occurring. If you look at a good example, we rolled out hair testing in Brazil. And in Brazil, they didn't have a DOT type of testing protocol. So they adopted it. And they adopted it, instead of saying with urine, it was going to be with hair. And I'll show you some reasons why when you look at a J.B. Hunt study, many of you have seen, but The impact within the first 6 months is dramatic. Now, granted, you're talking about a country that has been doing no drug testing at all. And so you had a lot of opportunities for people who end up working excessive hours, 80, 90 hours, 100 hours a week, taking drugs to stay awake. It was just a very encompassing issue that the United Nations ended up putting pressure on Brazil to do something about it. First 6 months, there was a 25% reduction in the number of accidents. Deaths and serious injuries was down 39% in the first 6 months. Drivers applying for CDL was down 31%. Now, that's the deterrent that you're always looking to accomplish, is to people who can't pass the test, don't take the tests. So anything you can do to maximize that deterrent, promoting it, whether it be in job sites, application pools, anything you can do to make sure they understand it's not just what you've just recently done, the last 2 or 3 days. Maybe marijuana and urine can go back a week or 2, but rather what your lifestyle has been. You've repeatedly used enough over the last 3 months to exceed the cutoff level and test positive. The goal here is that they would self-eliminate until they can clean up their act or go get help or go someplace else. And that also holds true for any company who would apply a random testing program. The goal here is not catching good people. The goal here is for them to change lifestyle, change behavior, seek help, or get out. So many unions that we've met with, in fact, every one of them that we've met with is ratified going from urine to hair, simply because the goal here is not detection. The goal here is deterrent. When you look at traffic deaths by themselves, just in that period of 15 to 16, down 21%, and that's deaths. And then the associated cost, 32%, that was 7.5 billion real. So it was a substantial financial impact. And the Institute for Transit Technologies president said the only thing difference of what we implemented was hair testing. So it has a dramatic impact. You look at a J.B. Hunt, which they used as a part of their basis for making that decision. J.B. Hunt started out obviously following regulated DOT testing, doing urinalysis, and chose to adopt in their own program, in-house program, hair testing, and doing it simultaneously. So these are side-by-side results. And when you look at both urine and hair being applied at the same time, you'll see over 112,000 samples, and they continue doing this today. Is that 809 of them were positive with urinalysis, but 5,700. Same people, same time. So the result is that you started seeing a positive rate that started out at a 15% positive rate, deter down to 5.3. That's what we were after, is the deterrent impact. And those results ended up launching a number of other companies to say, you know what, we're going to follow the regulated testing because we have to. But we, as a part of our company and our liabilities, is that we are, as a part of our company authority, going to do hair testing over and above that. Railroads have followed, many of them. And to give you an idea of that difference of what we found, and it was real eye-opening, it was the same kind of thing as you found in Brazil, is that those that were completely missed by urine, majority of them were cocaine. Why? Stimulant. Keep them going. Stay awake. Out of your system, 1 to 2 days. They all know it. They know how to play the game. And it's very difficult for a company and DOT to ensure regulations for an effective random test are being performed on a driver because of the limitations of the window of time. So the result is they knew how to play the game. As we rolled out contractor testing in a couple of major refineries here in the country, 80% of it was cocaine. They knew how to play the game. They knew it was in their system 1 to 2 days. They knew that simply if they knew how to work the process, but it was a stimulant given the hours they worked. So not uncommon, but you'll also see that marijuana was 1,000 of them, 1,004 samples were completely missed in urinalysis that were positive marijuana. The opiates, I'm going to show you some stats in a little bit of how it has trended since 2000 to date, and see how the drug pattern has shifted, but also see what the quantitative correlations, the level of drug, of what we're finding. But you'll also see is that they're positive urine only. So hair is not a panacea. It doesn't meet all circumstances. I showed you a slide earlier where they were talking about that first gap. So if in fact someone's used in the 5 to 7 days and they haven't used in the last 90, then urinalysis is going to find them and hair's going to miss them. If also this is someone who's used a very low level, in other words, over the weekend they used and they came to work, on Monday they were tested. Could be random, could be whatever reason. And the reality is they have no history. So again, that 5-day gap will come into play, but also it's the amount of level of drug that they used. Understanding what hair testing is showing versus urine, very complementary. But the reality is hair is showing we are a repeat usage lifestyle, repeating that behavior to a point that they exceed cutoff. Urinalysis is ultra sensitive. It detects very low levels of usage, but only for a short period of time, which can trigger issues having to do with taking wife's medication, 1 pill, 2 pills, triggered a positive in urine. In hair it would not. Because it hasn't, beyond the 5 days, there hasn't been enough accumulation to trigger the positive. So understand they're looking at two different things, short-term recent use and long-term historical use. So the balance really goes into how do we strengthen and have a comprehensive drug testing program. You look at entertaining both. You look at the economics and you have to make a decision. But other trucking companies have said, you know what? It's our company, it's our liability. If there's a truck driver that has a wreck, an accident, injury, we pay for that. So they too, in essence, have now formed a trucking alliance and put a lot of pressure, put a lot of heat. A couple of bills have passed through now, even hearing committees in Senate and House side. Excuse me. And they have now formed together these other trucking companies who are doing both, sharing that data. DOT really wants to move forward with hair testing. The challenge is that they're having Health and Human Services, HHS, develop a standard. The standard doesn't exist in hair testing, so hair testing labs will perform hair testing in a different manner, in a different way, and get different results. So the challenge goes into how do you come up with a federal standard that HHS can now hold accountable for labs doing hair tests to ensure there's accountability and repeatability in the same test. So key in that, and we'll get into some of the differences in how that occurs. If you look at some of the fundamentals of a hair test itself, obviously when drugs are ingested, they're in the bloodstream, permeate the body, deposited in the hair, and the interesting aspects, it's in proportion to the amount of drug they use. More drug metabolite, higher level. The key in that is be able to not only identify, but we could even take this 1.5 inches and segment it into 1/2 inch segments and show a level of drug usage over each of the last 3 months. Now, if it's an illegal drug, don't care. If it's a legal drug, might care. Might want to see if the prescription that they have was consistent with the accident, injury, the reason that they took it. The problem, as you well know, there's been the ever explosion of opiates. And you'll see some numbers here to kind of highlight that, but that quantitative correlation becomes very helpful on legal medications to make a determination, are they using it or are they abusing it? When you look at criteria, FDA has a requirement that all screens must be 510K cleared. 510K simply is saying is that you do what you claim you will do. And if it's a 4-hour cold tablet, you have to prove it works 4 hours. We claim that we get virtually 100% of the drug out of the hair. They concurred. And these are the only drugs that are FDA cleared. So cocaine, opiates, PCP, amphetamines, marijuana, benzodiazepines. We have applications in. They're going through the process for fentanyl. There's a long list of others that we're having. But FDA moves slowly. This is a different administration seems to be moving a little faster. So we'll see how those unfold. But those are required of any screen. Hair, urine, hair, it doesn't matter. Any screen is utilizing must be FDA cleared. If not, you pose a risk of not having an FDA cleared test. Still, you go into confirmation to confirm it, but that FDA clearance is important to demonstrate that you can, in fact, demonstrate your claim. Key elements to make sure what you're looking for in an effective hair test is that you've got to get all the drug out. If you get some of it out, you're going to miss users. Therein lies a part of the differences between labs. So the key is you've got to make sure that you get 100% or close to the drug out and consistently get it out. Your proven ability to make sure that it didn't come from exposure, didn't come from outside, but rather inside the hair. So it has to be an effective wash criteria. And that validation of having an effective mechanism to prove that it didn't come from being around it, but rather only from consumption. FBI did a study validating the fact that you've got to be able to have our particular test washes out any external contamination. We test the last wash, we validate that to ensure that what we're looking for came from consumption. Low QNS invalid rate. There you have inconsistencies of how much hair is taken. It kind of depends on the lab. Key in that is that you're not having to go back and take a retest, recollection, invalids, a number of reasons that would delay the hiring process, but more importantly, cost you in having to go back and do recollections. You have to make sure as well as FDA clearance that I mentioned, but the legal aspects. You've got to make sure that the test has been, the specific test, has been in fact supported, upheld, without exception, on legal cases, federal cases, employment cases, those cases that are very often tried by unions, arbitrations, those types of things. You've got to make sure that you have a test that you can stand on. There's no gray area in a drug test. It's got to be black, it's got to be white. Can't have gray, otherwise you're talking litigation. Got some workplace data that I thought I'd share with you. This is data that's been gathered since the year 2000. So what I thought I would do is kind of reveal what drugs and shifts have been since that period of time, and then show you some other items that you might find of interest. But in 2000, the majority of the drug that you ended up finding was marijuana. You had an overall 4% positive rate in 2001, with marijuana representing 2.8 of the 4. So the majority of the drug we found green marijuana. Then you find the smattering of cocaine and then amphetamine. So this is, as we reveal this is millions of samples, and it'll be a very interesting shift. And then we can look at it by industry, both in the, whether you're talking the oil and gas, upstream, downstream market segment, and then we can also look at it from other manufacturing. We do General Motors, Toyota, BMW, there's a long list of others from a manufacturing sector, and as well transportation. But as you begin to kind of reveal the shift, this is 2002, 2003, and interesting up here, you'll see this is opiates. So opiates were still very low in terms of the percentage of what we would find, with half of it being marijuana. But you'll also see an ever-increasing amount of cocaine, 2002, so 3. So you go into 2004, so again, marijuana being the majority, 2005, 2006. Again, look what happened here with cocaine. Cocaine becomes, now bear in mind, these data points are showing hair testing, so we're looking at the last 90 days. So we're revealing more than your analysis ever can, simply because of the limitations of the window of time. So you're seeing things in your analysis, the majority of what you're going to always find is marijuana, wider window of detection. Is it the drug of choice? You'll see. It's always been presented as such because that's what they find given the limited window of detection. So hair's revealing a much larger window, but we're also seeing a shift of drug, where in fact a 4.1% positive rate or even a 4.9% positive rate, more than half it's cocaine. If you go into 2007, it continues to grow. The red is cocaine. 2008, see marijuana is still pretty high, but the drug of choice, 2007, 2008 is still cocaine. Marijuana is steady. It's interesting how it begins to shift, but look what's beginning to step up. Opiates, 2009, 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So clearly, when you start looking at now, what is it that we're finding? It's opiates. You can look at marijuana, is pretty steady. The problems you get into now is that, you know, the use of marijuana is going to continue becoming, you look at the litigations, you know, it's going to be becoming more evident, more of it. The problem that you're going to start running into is you start hiring more people who are easily getting Colorado, Washington, and you go right on down the line. It's going to be more difficult to find people who can pass a drug test. If you move into now 17, and bear in mind, interesting that those, you have 6.8% positive rate, but you have a 1.1% poly users. So these are using more than one drug. You get into 17, and then 18, so far. So we're at a 5.8% overall, with about 4.9 as singled and poly users. But you get into the drug category, you know, clearly marijuana is pretty static. And interestingly to see that the opiates begin to trend down. So is there an impact on the federal government beginning to squeeze down on these prescriptions? I think so. Doctors, I think there's a recognition of the problem and finally doing something about it. What I thought I'd show you specifically having to do with the last 2 years in looking at the overall positive rates for marijuana. Now, this overall positive rate for marijuana is broken down quantitatively. Cutoff level is 1 picogram. So we range between 110, 1020, 2030, 40, 50, and so forth. So I thought I would show you that might be of interest of what we're finding in terms of quantitative level. Now, understanding to get to cutoff, this isn't use at any level. This is repeated use to a certain level, which simply means is that depending on the potency, and that's going to be the tricky item, this is someone who may be smoking a couple of joints a month for the last 3 months. It could be a little more depending on how weak it is. It could be a little less depending on how strong it is. But it didn't occur from passive inhalation. It didn't occur from one-time incidental use. It didn't occur when you got drunk at a wedding and smoked a joint. You've had to repeat that behavior just to get to 1 picogram. Most employers aren't looking for an angel. They're trying to control risk and loss. When we do police departments, New York, Chicago, Boston, we do schools, those cutoff levels are cut in half. Because the corporate level is more about trying to identify someone who poses a risk to the company. We have a lot lower tolerance for people who are police and trying to identify kids who are using to try and intervene, quantitatively show how much they're using, but to stop them, hopefully effectively deter them. And thousands of schools that we're doing across the country. But when you start looking at where the majority of the marijuana that we're finding, you'll see generally it's from 0 to, let's call it 5 before you find a really steep drop-off. So the vast majority of users aren't heavy. That's these out here. But rather they're people who are using enough to trigger positive, but they're using. And that's the difficult part, is where do you draw a line? So it's you know, things having to do with, more importantly, if you don't get the drug out, you're going to miss them. So ultimately, you're really trying to identify, and this applies to whether it's marijuana, whether it's opiates, you know, whether it's cocaine, you know, illegal drugs, different story. You're really not very tolerant. Certain industries are much less tolerant of marijuana use because of the safety nature of what they do. Other industries are more tolerant, and they'll move cutoff levels. They'll suppress marijuana, won't even look for it because they can't find anybody. So it depends on the market segment that you're in and the hiring pressures, but the safety-sensitive nature applies to so many that most companies are grappling with, what can we do and what should we do? And most are turning around saying is that the risk of what our employees do, and sometimes it's just driving a car, far outweighs the liberal left side of what we need to do in changing policy. That's not easy, so there's no quick, simple answer to it. So we end up having to look at what are we finding? Well, the vast majority of what we end up finding is low-level users. If you look at, we instituted a program that tracks contractor testing. And this was very revealing in trying to look at a couple of sides of, what kind of positive rate do we find? Because this is looking at both those who tested positive and then those results went to an MRO and were reviewed by an MRO and fed back into this vector program. So the result is that we've got both sides, released by lab, released by MRO. It was first initiated in 2008. There were 708 contractor companies. Now, contractor companies are those who work, most of you, who work into refineries, may work upstream, may do a number of things, and owners require that they have a hair test. So Psychemedics hair test, and so they end up doing that. So we had 708 contractor companies participating, small, medium, large. 32,000 contractors, individuals, are being monitored in this with 38,000 samples. If you start looking at the progression of what we ended up finding, just in positives versus MRO, you can see how this has kind of grown. So now there are over 5,000 contractors, over 500,000 individuals that are being monitored in compliance to the business rules of the site, and 1.1 million samples that are either made up of pre-access, random, periodic, whatever the policy requires, and so forth, tests. So there's a lot of people, but you can look at also, of the 74,000 positives that were found, a 6.3% overall positive rate. You can see MRO positives were 6.3. So those were upheld by the MRO and action was taken. If you look at some things that are kind of interesting as well in the progression of the by drug category, you can see back as we were kind of looking at the breakout of the drug categories, cocaine back in 2008 being the drug of choice of what we were finding. 2009, down a little bit. And then here you have, I'll just walk you through the progression. Opiates. Now, opiates are codeine, morphine, heroin, hydrocodone, oxycodone, hydromorphone, oxymorphone. So the synthetic opiates. And as you go through its continued rise, so you can see that it had a peak in 2016, but I think there's been an impact and a recognition, and people are becoming more aware. It's still predominant, but as you start seeing the overall positives that we're finding, they're beginning to diminish, and guess who we're seeing pop their ugly head up? Cocaine and marijuana. So drug choices are going to shift all the time. And the problem is that labs are always behind the 8 ball. So we're always trying to catch up, introducing things from synthetic marijuana, being able to test for the fentanyls that we're applying for. That be concerned because that's being mixed in with cocaine and heroin and these other things that are killing people. Because this fentanyl sometimes is coming more often from China, and they have no idea how potent. It's 50 times stronger than heroin, so it's killing them. But you'll see this shift, and I think there'll continue being a shift. I think you'll see as legal marijuana is coming on in various states and so forth, and those industries that are non-tolerant of it, there may be a shift over to synthetic marijuana, K2. maybe going back to that, because if you're not testing for it, then they may turn around and say, well, you know, they're always looking for the crack in the door. So trying to run that down is always going to mean a continued process of looking at what kind of drugs should we be testing for. There are other drugs that are already being prescribed, you know, that are being tested for in a legacy 10 panel. But those become a part of, are we shifting and moving our panels to meet the need of what in fact is occurring? And we should rely on legacies who are not even being, you know, barbiturates are, you know, not hardly being prescribed. So hydrocodone, you know, have really kind of taken over so much of that use and on. But I thought you would find some of these, some of this data, because this is millions of samples over many years of being able to look at both in different industries but different market segments. One thing I didn't show you, I've got a little bit of time, this was particularly oil and gas. But if I go into the manufacturing sector, now manufacturing sectors are things that are General Motors, Toyota, I mean these are steel. We do all of various new steel operations, Nucor Steel and US Steel. You'll see not that much of a difference compared oil and gas, manufacturing. Select all classes. If you look at transportation, drug of choice, again, it's not much different, even though the percentages are a little different, but the overall positive rate, 8.5%. You look at manufacturing, overall positive rate, 9%. If you look at oil and gas, overall positive rate, 5.8. So better than most. Gaming, the mini casinos and so forth, 12%. Food and drug, or food and beverage, 9.6. Educational sector, 3.4. Again, what's the drug of choice? That's marijuana. Finally it wins. It's an ongoing battle, and all other corporate kind of combined really kind of sets a stage for everything that's not in these market segments falls into this, but you can see that the predominant player is opiates. Thought I would show you some data of different industries and how they might compare and different drug categories, but invariably as you're dealing with the shift of marijuana, it's such it's concerning with behaviors, legalization, the impact on kids. You know, there's just a long, long list of scenarios. But understand too, when you start looking at the poly users, many of the poly users we have are also smoking weed. So sometimes it's the gateway, as you've always heard. Listen, thank you all so very much. I sure appreciate it.